Thank you for listening to We Have Ways of Making You Talk. Sign up to our Patreon to receive bonus content, live streams, and our weekly newsletter with money off books and museum visits as well, plus early access to all live show tickets. That's patreon.com/wehaveways.
Romans, I will give you the greatest games on earth!
Show them you can fight or die trying.
From the producers of 300.
A 4-horse race is a suicide.
Let the games begin!
Starring Oscar winner Anthony Hopkins.
Behold, this arena will be built for Rome.
Rise or die.
Those About to Die. A new Peacock original series streaming July 18th.
Achtung, Achtung! Gott in Himmel, was passiert, mein Führer? Welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk. The Second World War.
That was really good, by the way.
I think we have quite the Gott in Himmel for us. Today. Welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk, the Second World War podcast for all your Second World War podcasting needs. With me, Al Murray, James Holland, and James, we are joined by a very special guest for a very special topic. One of the big what ifs of the Second World War. And if you're asking yourself the question, what if you attempt to assassinate Hitler and fail? This is what will happen.
Yes, it is, of course, Operation Valkyrie. It's the Stauffenberg plot. It's the plot to assassinate Hitler. It's the briefcase that goes off but doesn't kill him and only shreds his jacket, etc., and trousers. And we've got a very special guest today. We've got a great friend of the show, great friend of ours, Roger Morehouse, who's a brilliant historian, and we couldn't really think of a better person to join us and help us weave our way through this minefield of Nazi plots.
Welcome, Roger. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you for that lovely introduction.
Now, we'll get to the plot itself, but I think we need to set the scene. After all, this couldn't have happened at a worse... We'll go back to who Stauffenberg is and who the people on the plot. This couldn't really happen at a more critical moment for the German government, could it? This attempted assassination of Hitler. I mean, it's the height of Normandy, the height of collapse on the Eastern Front.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
They picked their moment, didn't they? If nothing else.
Yeah, they did. And I think that's one of those aspects that's actually really significant is in terms of the motivation of the plot, because people often imagine from that timing that you just mentioned that, this was sort of, Johnny come latelys, that they've seen the writing on the wall. Yeah. Germany's obviously going to lose by that point. It's pretty clear to anyone with eyes in their head. And that's the primary motivation for the plot. And it's not entirely untrue. I mean, you'd be a fool to deny that as a motivation for at least some of the plotters, but it is more than that, as I'm sure we'll go into in due course.
Yeah, at the centre of the whole thing is Claus von Stauffenberg. And because Tom Cruise played him as a straight good guy, there is this assumption that somehow he's exonerated from all Nazi crimes and that, he is a good guy and a good bloke and just an honest soldier trying to do his bit and blah, blah, blah. But he's a bit more nuanced than that, isn't he?
Oh, much more. Yeah, yeah.
And it's not anything like as straightforward, is it? I think he obviously is the key figure, and it'd be interesting to sort of have a look at his life and
and he is
how he got to that point.
Yeah, you use that word nuance, Jim, which is he's definitely nuanced to Stauffenberg. And I think there's we live in an age where history tends to get sort of grossly simplified very often, or ignored entirely, either one. Or where it's used at all, it's grossly simplified and kind of instrumentalized. And he's one, there are very few bright points in Germany's wartime history. But they consider him to be one, right? So he's sort of adopted as one of Germany's heroes, which is not untrue. I mean, it's absolutely, it was a very tremendously brave thing to have done and morally, I think, correct to have done what he did. But that doesn't necessarily, as you say, make him one of the good guys. It doesn't make him on our side. So that jump is one that we should resist making.
Well, yes, and he sort of, in a way, represents Germany as it was in a sense, doesn't it? And Germany as it was isn't a thing that anyone would really want anything to do with if they're thinking clearly. He's entirely. I mean, we'll get into it. The things he's for are not necessarily things one would want to be for oneself.
Yeah. I mean, he's old-fashioned nobility. He has you say, I mean, you're absolutely right. You say he's for the old Germany, if you like, the Germany that came before, the Third Reich and came before the Weimar Republic. He didn't like the Weimar Republic. He didn't like the idea of democracy. He talked about the myth of equality, right?
Yeah, yeah,
which is a lovely phrase.
And it's very much the Germany that gave birth to and accommodated Nazism, isn't it? This is the truth. And so he's quite a sort of a grey area if you're going to make him a hero, isn't he?
Absolutely. You're right. I mean, you summed it up there. I think he said he represented that old Germany, the Germany that had gone before, the empire that collapsed in 1918. He's from that milieu, although he's right at the tail end of it.
Yeah. So let's look at who he is. So he's born in 1907. He's a Catholic, isn't he?
Yes, Catholic. I mean, he never really sort of claimed that was a sort of significant part of his being, as it were. But yes, he was raised.
I always get the impression, Roger, that the Catholicism and the Christianity are kind of. That's part of the kind of myth, isn't it? That here's a kind of, a beacon and amongst all this kind of awfulness and that kind of thing. I mean, is that fair, do you think? Well, he's just a Christian, he's God-fearing, all this kind of stuff, and so therefore he's a good guy. And again, kind of two don't quite...
Hugely nuanced, Jim.
Hugely nuanced, and it doesn't quite follow.
Because, Nazism in its most extreme forms of the SS and stuff is kind of anti-Christian and is atheistic. But there's also a huge number of faithful Christians that become good Nazis. They make their peace with the regime. So and it was Hitler himself was a lapsed Catholic. He knew well enough that you couldn't kind of go into bat against religion because it was too powerful.
I mean, what you're not doing there is making the argument for lapsed Catholics being the worst people on the earth, though, are you?
No, that's true. No, absolutely not.
By lumping Hitler in with them.
No.
But he's a Fon, isn't he? So that's the other thing. Right.
Yeah. So nobility from down southwest Germany, from Württemberg. He's educated down there, Stuttgart. Very much that sort of traditional, nobility kind of milieu that he grows up in.
What is it? Is that Westphalia? Is that Westphalia?
Westphalia is further north. Is up around sort of Hanover and up there. So he's right down in the southwest. It's that sort of traditional milieu. Just scouting movement as a boy. Very nationalistic. I mean, he's also supposedly comes from quite a liberal. I suppose it's all relative, but his family was described as being quite liberal. And there's a crucial element of his youth that comes in, which I think you can see as a sort of a red thread almost through his worldview, and then also as to why he does what he does, which is the influence of a slightly obscure German poet, whose name was Stefan George. And he was someone who was, again, sort of nationalistic, but very kind of culturally nationalistic. So he was very interested in, preserving the sort of what he would have seen as the cultural superiority and the cultural importance of Germany and German culture.
And this is all kind of sort of trekked and kind of hiking in the mountains and being manly and physical. And okay, and
that's one side of it. And then the other side, what I think George is much more interested in is what we probably call high culture. Right, is literature, is the arts,
so Goethe and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so he's much more, in that sense, culturally nationalistic.
And Wagner, where does Wagner come into it?
Wagner would absolutely fit into that.
He's in that mix, the symbolists and all that, isn't he? So, and the idea that it's Blätter für die Kunst and all that sort of stuff.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, so it's all of that. I think we can call it cultural nationalism. Yeah. And that becomes very significant for, particularly for Stauffenberg, but also for some of the others around him.
But sorry, Roger, just to go back to this sort of, this secret Germany thing and Stefan George. I mean, is that all part of the kind of sort of emergence of Germany in 1871 as a nation state? This idea that because there's always been this collection of German peoples, now it is a state. Does that kind of sort of that insecurity about the newness of the nation state, does that reinforce the desire to sort of home into cultural traditions that go further back as a kind of means of reinforcing that kind of new nationalism?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit more recent in that sense than 1871. I think if you look back to 1918 and the collapse of the empire, and you look at Weimar and all of the troubles that Weimar experienced and brought with it, the economic turmoil and then the political turmoil. I think you can see people like George to some extent are kind of using, that culture, German culture, they're almost using it as a comfort blanket. They're sort of saying this, it might be chaotic, but at least we can hang on to this body of German culture.
I suppose what I'm driving at is that there is this very strong sense of Germanness, I think, that kind of runs through those elites. This sense of kind of sort of militarism at the back of the, that's a big part of it. Sports, horsemanship, sophistication, high literature, music, all this sort of stuff. You are, but it's all part of that kind of sort of, it's a cultural elite as well, isn't it? It's a kind of sense of their own superiority,
but not a million miles from some elements of British culture at the same time.
Oh no, not at all. I would agree.
The thing, we're not talking about a thing that you could overlay this on plenty of British cavalrymen who are high church, culturally interested in the finer things in life and how those inform being British and all that sort of stuff. This is the interesting point, isn't it? Where sort of that kind of nationalism in Germany departs from a thing we can map ourselves onto, I guess. Or map our culture onto. And these poets, it's all very self-conscious though, isn't it? And I mean, I think when you say Weimar's troubles, I mean, Weimar's troubles, a lot of how Weimar's troubles are viewed has come to us through a Nazi prism, after all, where so much of their propaganda has remained sticky and successful that it's decadent, that it's corrupt, that it can't make a decision. Pair that away from what the Nazis said about Weimar Germany, the Republic. It wasn't even called the Weimar Republic. That's a thing that we've inherited from that prism of Nazi critique.
Yeah, that's true.
Which I think is an interesting piece of thing to hold on to and to remember. Of course, these people opposed it. Of course, they didn't like it. They're not necessarily being reasonable in doing so either.
To go back to your point there, when you said that, that comparison with a contemporary, British cavalryman, as it were. I mean, we know that Stauffenberg becomes a cavalryman. It's a really important one because the British cavalryman had the empire, right? He had the empire to sort of to be a vehicle for his ambitions and for his patriotism and all of that. Someone like Stauffenberg didn't, because they viewed Weimar as being a rejection of all of that. And to some extent, it was. I mean, he looked back to an older Germany, to the imperial Germany. Weimar had abolished all nobility and noble titles, for example, and that to someone like Stauffenberg, who's unashamedly elitist, right, is absolutely anathema. It's a terrible thing that they did that. So he's really very very elitist in his view, and he views democracy itself as a bad thing, right? And he views the Nazis. He refers to them in this phase. He refers to them as the brown plague, right? They're sort of something from the street. They're beneath him, right? Yeah, which is an important element of how he sees the world.
But then, of course, what the Nazis do is successfully co-opt the army, and so he's part of that co-option, isn't he? So
absolutely.
But by the time the government's spending money on, he marries in 1933. They have 5 children, but by the time the government are spending money on the army, that's the thing that shuts people like him up, essentially, isn't it?
Yeah, because
does he marry aristocratically as well?
Yes,
is his wife an aristocrat?
Yeah, absolutely.
So absolutely keeping it in the kind of within the folds of his class and everything.
Yeah, completely. So that's his worldview, and as I said, he's very critical of the Nazis. He sees them as being kind of, as I said, the brown plague, something from the streets, something he might find on the bottom of his shoe. But then, by the time that they're, in power in 33 and then rearming massively as they do through the later 30s, he's part of all of that. He's then training at the General Staff.
And sorry, Roger, do we know what he's thinking about the regime at this point? At the point he's going to General Staff training in 1936 and,
yeah, he's one of those.
Participating in the occupation of Sudetenland a couple of years later. I mean, how's he viewing the regime now?
Well, we know there's references, letters home from, takes part in the Polish campaign in 39, for example. And his letters home there, they kind of almost exactly kind of reflect, the regime's propaganda. So he talks about the Poles as, the phrase he uses is, an extremely mixed population, which is code, right? It's code for there are lots of Jews here. And he talks about the Poles as a sort of subject people who are only comfortable under the knout. So this is an old fashioned. I mean, this predates the Nazis, obviously, because that was the old German imperial view as well. It's a bit like the British view of the Irish. The way the Germans view the Poles is almost entirely analogous to the old British view of the Irish, right? That they're inferior, they're culturally inferior, they're Catholics. So you can't trust Catholics anyway. Right. So part of, how they viewed themselves was as a civilizing mission. And you can see that comes through the 19th century in Imperial Germany's attitudes to Poland, and it comes through, in the 20th with Nazi attitudes to Poland, obviously with a turbocharged, exactly, racist element, exterminatory element to it. But in essence, it's the same thing, and that's what Stauffenberg is reflecting. So you can see from that, he's kind of bought into it all. He's bought into this sort of, neo-colonial rhetoric about Lebensraum. This is what we're going to do. We're going to colonize Poland. The Poles aren't worth, tuppence because these people are so racially mixed, as he says. So he's bought into a lot of the rhetoric of the regime, but I think fundamentally he still sees it as being, something beneath his own dignity. But he's willing to ride the tiger for a while.
Right. I mean, it is interesting, isn't it? Because all those those German aristocrats, who are, imperialists, don't like democracy, don't like Weimar, want to return to kind of sort of imperialist ways. And suddenly you've got this working class party and you've got a working class Führer leader from Vienna, after all, not, from Linz rather, from Austria rather than from Germany. I mean, how do they kind of come to terms with that? Are they always sort of looking down their noses, do you think? Or do you think they get...
Some of them are definitely seduced. I mean, you can look at, that great example of Prince August Wilhelm, Alvi, who joined the SA and had those terrible pictures of him wearing SA uniform. He sort of decided to go all in. And there are other examples like that. And then there are other examples the other way of people who saw, we'll come to Henning von Tresckow later on.
Yes.
Henning von Tresckow is a great example of someone who saw
for what it was.
Really with absolute clarity what Hitler was in the mid-1930s. And I have to say, it takes remarkable clarity of vision and moral clarity, I think, to make those calls in 36, 37, 38, which is when Hitler's at the absolute peak of his power. Right. So Germany is very, very obviously on the up. I mean, anyone can see that, it's rearming, it's restoring, as it would see it, its place in the world. Remilitarization of the Rhineland in 36, 2 fingers up to the Western powers and to the Versailles Treaty. Anschluss with Austria in 38, and all of this, of course, has been achieved bloodlessly.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
By basically facing down the Western powers and saying, we're going to do this and you're not going to stop us. So, for that generation of Germans, whether they be working class or aristocracy, this is tremendously seductive stuff.
Yeah. Well, and if you're a professional soldier, you're getting all the toys to play with you ever dreamt of, and and prestige comes with it, and it's the it's the conspicuous consumption of military spending. Hitler is giving them these soldiers what they want.
Absolutely.
After all.
Yeah.
And the public bloodless victories. I mean, it's sort of. You're absolutely right. It must have been extremely difficult to stand against
that. Yeah,
really, really hard. And the fact that people in the West are going, you know what, it's not like you can appeal to people in the West either, saying this is a moral sewer, we need to do something about this, because people in the West are sympathetic, or at least saying to themselves, well, thank goodness Germany's sort of back on track and sorting itself out, and the excesses are what they are, and he doesn't mean any of it anyway, and all that.
I mean, yeah, there were enough voices in the West that were saying, on Britain, that were saying exactly that, Al, saying, well, the rhetoric is what it is, but, Germany's back on track, and it's a, good trading partner, and
they're a proud people, and they need stuff to be proud of.
And it will be a bulwark against the Soviet Union, and all of those. That was being said in British circles. Never mind what's going on in Germany. So I think in that sense, we have to understand the world that they all come from, and how seductive that was. And in a sense, I suppose, not throw Stauffenberg under the bus. I mean, I'm always quite willing to throw Stauffenberg under the bus, but in that sense, I think we have to appreciate where he was coming from. And actually, his going along with the regime in that early period is entirely in keeping with the vast majority of his fellows.
So what are the elements of German military resistance? What is there in the 30s before we get to the war? What's going on?
Not that much, you have to say. There are a few individuals that you can pull up.
There's Hilter, isn't there, in 1939, sort of giving the shakes of his revolver.
There was a plot in 38 around the Sudeten crisis, but if we go right back, there was right at the beginning of Hitler's chancellorship. So I think it's February the 3rd. 1933. So Hitler's been chancellor for precisely 4 days, right? And he has his first meeting with the general staff. And there's a memorandum that was written of that meeting, which is known as the Liebmann Memorandum. And it basically records everything he said. And he basically said that, well, my ambition is, and bear in mind, Hitler's just come to power. He's actually at the head of a coalition government. It's not even a Nazi, majority government. It's a coalition government. And he goes into the general staff and he basically says, my ambition is to, two things: overturn Versailles, which is already in the process of dismantling anyway. And he says, smash Marxism. So this is unashamedly aggressive. And the general staff, basically, they kind of shrug and they go, oh, well, okay. Well, that sounds interesting. Only one person actually does anything about it, who actually dissents. His name was Hammerstein Eckford. Lovely name. And he's the only one that dissents from this vision that Hitler presents to them. And, he's expecting others to sort of follow suit, and they don't. So the general staff right from the outset are sort of prepared to go along with all of this for all the reasons that we just mentioned. One of the sort of seminal moments here is the Night of the Long Knives in the summer of 1934, the following year. Sometimes you talk about the Röhm purge, when they got rid of Ernst Röhm and they got rid of the SA, the Sturmabteilung, the brown shirts, because of this sort of trumped up idea that they were going to lead a putsch against Hitler, which is not true. But in the process of that, Hitler ordered this basic sort of clearing of the decks of anyone that had criticized him, anyone that he didn't like. It's basically open season on anyone that had sort of pissed Hitler off in the previous 10 years. And there are two generals who are executed by the SS during that purge, von Bredow and von Schleicher. Von Schleicher actually had been chancellor before Hitler, but he was also a general in the Reichswehr. And that, to a lot of military men, that was a moment, right? That was a moment where you kind of go,
steady on.
What on earth is going on here? They're killing ours now, right? Yeah. That this is kind of it's murder. It's outright murder. I mean, I think it was von Bredow. There's a knock on the door, and late at night he opens the door, and there's two SS assassins there, and they basically gun him down in his own doorway. So it's not even a judicial execution. It's literally on your own doorstep, an execution. So that actually makes a lot of military men kind of at least cock an eyebrow and think, well, what's going on here? And start to think maybe differently about the regime. And that certainly is the case with Henning von Tresckow. He referred back to these two murders, executions, as being sort of the moment that he began to see, with clarity what was going on.
And just very briefly tell us about von Tresckow, because I've always found him incredibly intriguing, and personally I found him a much more simpatico figure than von Stauffenberg.
Yeah, I agree.
Brutally honest. Yeah. I think he's fascinating, and never seems to have. There doesn't seem to be quite the same level of nuance.
Get the credit.
That word we keep saying.
Yeah. Well,
seems
you're right, because he does. That's the thing that's I find wonderful about it. I mean, look, this is
if only the Cointreau had worked.
Yeah, yeah. Well, this is what's interesting. I mean, if you look at, I know we're jumping around a bit, but if we look at the story of Oskar Schindler, for example, right?
Yes.
What makes Oskar Schindler's story fascinating is the moral arc. Like the fact that he starts out as a Nazi and he basically has this sort of conversion and he becomes this, he does great things in the end. And that's what makes the story interesting. And in a sense, it's the same with Stauffenberg, right? Because he goes along with it for a long time. And then he sort of has this Damascene conversion and thinks, okay, well, maybe I'm the man to do something. And that's what makes his story so fascinating. I mean, someone like Tresckow, on the other hand, is pretty constant in opposing the regime,
what's his background,
which is kind of morally or laudable, but it's a little bit less interesting than Stauffenberg. So I think that's part of it.
Yeah,
his background, again, very Prussian, very military family. He'd actually served in the First World War. He's a little bit older than Stauffenberg. He's born in, I think, 1901. So as a very young man, he served at the end of the First World War.
And he's a guardsman, isn't he?
Guardsman, yeah, first Guards regiment, and he was, I think, he was the youngest lieutenant in the German army in 1918. So he was already commissioned then. So, and he was destined for great things. Was a very good soldier.
His commanding officer, the First Regiment of Foot Guards, Count Siegfried von Eulenburg, said, "You, Tresckow, will either become chief of the general staff or die on the scaffold as a rebel."
Lovely quote, that.
Amazing, isn't it?
I mean, it's too good to be true.
And he was right.
And he was right. Yeah. Too good to be true, that quote, really, isn't it? It's amazing. Yeah. It is a bit, yeah.
But no, but he carried on, as a career soldier through Weimar in the Reichswehr. And yeah, as you said, very much in that same mold, except that, he was able, with that moral clarity that he was able to see very early on what the Nazis were all about. And he says already, I think there's a quote from him I think it's from 1938. He describes Hitler as a whirling dervish. And he says that Hitler must be shot down. And to say that in 1938 as a German military man is kind of remarkably prescient. It's remarkable clarity of thought.
And then the Commissar order, he says, remember this moment. If we don't convince von Bock to fly to Hitler at once and have these orders cancelled, the German people will be burdened with a guilt the world will not forget in 100 years. This guilt will fall not only on Hitler, Himmler, Goering and their comrades, but on you and me, your wife and mine, your children and mine, that woman crossing the street and those children over there playing
ball.
That is a wonderful. I mean, that quote makes the hairs on back of my neck stand up. I think that is, and he's absolutely right. He's saying this is existential for the German people, right? We are going to be bearing the guilt for this for generations to come. Yeah. And he says that already, and that's in 41, right, with the Commissar order. He can see it with absolute clarity. It's astonishing. So I agree. I mean, Tresckow's a really remarkable guy, and I think this is. We haven't mentioned my book yet. I'm sure it will get mentioned somewhere.
Very happy to mention your book, Roger. Multiple books.
Well, Killing Hitler, on this stuff, I wrote Killing Hitler a long time ago, nearly 20 years ago, believe it or not.
Goodness me.
And in that, I wanted to kind of raise the other assassins, people like Georg Elser, but particularly Tresckow, to the same sort of level of recognition that Stauffenberg enjoyed, because, like you said, Jim, I find Tresckow really, really interesting, and actually, he has that a sort of moral appeal because he was right about so much and so early on.
Also, from a banal point of view, it's also, I think it's interesting that Kenneth Branagh played both von Tresckow and Heydrich.
Yeah, very true. Yeah.
Well, let's take a break and come back to basically 1941 when the plots start to pull together and Barbarossa kicking things into motion. We'll see you in a moment. Welcome back to We Have Ways of Making You Talk, where we're talking to Roger Moorhouse about the plot to kill Hitler. And it's not just a plot to kill Hitler. It's a rolling series of plots, isn't it, that are set in motion by the attack on the USSR, essentially. And when we touched on the von Trescow's reaction to the Commissar order, but he then mobilizes, and this is what's interesting: is it's him that really, he's the sort of the core of all this, isn't it? Actually,
yeah, he is. I mean,
if it's a stick of rock, he's running through. He
does run through it. I think it's worth mentioning in case you get people shouting at their shouting at their computers, I suppose, shouting at their computers whilst walking the dog, shouting at their phones. We should mention the Abwehr just briefly from the late 1930s, because that's another significant one, which has importance because it plays into Trescow and Stauffenberg later on. So the Abwehr plot, which was supposedly, where they wanted to sort of time some sort of revolt with German mobilization to invade Czechoslovakia, but they wanted the West to play ball, basically. So if the West was going to stand up to Hitler in 1938, then that would be their trigger to try and arrest him. And then within the plot, there was this sort of secondary plot to actually assassinate him in 1938 as well, because they realized that, you can't just arrest him and put him on trial. He has to actually be killed. So that was, that's Hans Oster and Admiral Canaris, in a sense, is sort of significant, I think, psychological and moral preparation, in a sense, for a lot that follows.
Yes, to countenance the idea, even. Yeah.
So, but what's the spirit of Zossen and Franz Halder, who is the chief of staff of the army in 1939? And there's a moment where he's encouraged to assassinate Hitler, and he's got a revolver in his pocket, and he just gets the shakes and just starts to sweat nervously and just can't bring himself to do it. And the opportunity passes. And then he really gets the heebie-jeebies because someone talks about the spirit of Zossen, and the plot has come from a kind of from the OKH, the command of the army at Zossen, which is this complex sort of southeast of Berlin, later converted into a Soviet Cold War command post and huge concrete bunkers and all the rest of it. But how far, how seriously should one take those plots and that plot that Halder's involved with? I
think that there's a lot of this kind of, certainly after 41. So 41, as I said, I wanted to just sort of name check the Abwehr there, but after 41 is significant because, as we mentioned before, the Commissar
rather than
order,
1940.
Yeah, it is. I mean, 40 is,
and 1939 shouldn't really, but the Halder one's a bit half cock, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And there are, it's interesting. There's a couple of half baked plots that they even approach Stauffenberg because they're related and they're sort of distant cousins, which tells you something, right?
Who is Trescow and Stauffenberg?
No, I think they were also related, but this is going back to people like von Schwerin and others who, there's the beginnings of this sort of plot, and they know he's in the military, he's in the general staff. So he's approached, I think, in 1940, and he basically says, "Oh no, I'm not doing that." And his get out is, well, he's sort of made an oath of allegiance to Hitler, and to Hitler personally. It wasn't to the constitution or to the state.
The old Kesselring line.
Exactly. Yeah. So that was his get out then, regardless of what he might have thought about the regime. But 41 is very significant in that sense because it shows the regime, the Nazi regime, in a way, kind of breaking all the rules. And for those that had been willing to go along with this because, it put Germany back on the map, it put Germany back on its feet, it righted, as they saw it, the wrong of the First World War. So you can see 1940 in that context as a great moment for people like Stauffenberg. But 41, with the obvious genocide which is going on behind the lines already in that autumn of 41 against the Jews and against anyone that looks at the Germans askance on the Eastern Front, there is the beginnings of, and you have to use this phrase, a moral revolt, right? They say, this is wrong. We cannot go along with this. And this is exactly that point that you quoted Trescow, that point about we have to stand up and do something because this is generational guilt that we're bringing on ourselves. That wonderful quote that you used before. So that it is an absolute step change in the thinking behind those who would resist.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, it's not the Treaty of Versailles anymore, is it?
No, exactly. Yeah,
we're knocking out France in a matter of weeks really does resets the ledger, doesn't it? After the humiliation of the end of the First World War, which, after all, Germany didn't lose. They, if you're
stabbed in the back,
if you're those people. So, but this is of a different order. So
it goes back a bit. So this is where, sorry to interrupt you, but it goes back a bit to, we were talking about Stefan George and, the secret Germany. This goes back to the idea of Germany as a cultured nation, right? And what Germany is doing in 41, I mean, of course, it's doing it in 39 as well. I mean, written about that in the Polish context. Poland is no less brutal. The Polish campaign is no less brutal than what follows. But it kind of was glossed over to some extent. But 41 is a question of scale. But for people like Stauffenberg, this is that image of Germany as the cultured nation disgracing itself. Right?
Yeah.
That's the issue. So increasingly you get the question, well, maybe something should be done about this. If so, what? If so, who's going to do it?
But the twist in fate that offers Stauffenberg the opportunity to do this is that he's injured in North Africa, so isn't a frontline soldier anymore, and suddenly is in contact with the world of because people on the front line haven't got the luxury of or the ability to plot to kill the Fuhrer,
or the bandwidth, you'd think,
exactly right, yeah. So he's in North Africa in March 43 with 10th Panzer, and he's fighting in Tunisia. And towards the end, so it's April where he's injured by a strafing raid, and Tom Cruise handles this very well. He wears an eye patch, he wears black gloves, he hobbles about, but he's really badly smashed up, isn't he? And not expected to survive. Sent home in the expectation that he's basically a goner.
So his right hand is amputated because it's too badly damaged, and he loses the ring finger and the little finger of his left hand. So he's got the thumb and index and middle finger. That's all he's got. One eye is lost. He takes a bullet in the eye, which is kind of somehow unthinkable. But anyway, and countless shrapnel injuries. And as you say, he's not expected to survive. He's one of those that really by rights probably should have ended up in a cemetery in Tunisia, but remarkably survived and came back to Germany. Numerous operations. I mean, his recuperation, such as it was, I think is a sort of remarkable testament to who the man was. I mean, like we said before, I'm quite willing to criticise where criticism is due with Stauffenberg. But the fact that, he learned to write left-handed with two fingers and a thumb, for example, it really worked hard so that he could write again. He learned to tie his own shoelaces, for example.
Yeah. I suppose also he's come back to the exigencies of the front, mean that you're living in that world. But you come back to Germany, and you see the state Germany's in and what the government are doing and pressure on the civilian population from strategic bombing and all that. You maybe wake up to, on the front, you're a soldier and you're focused on that. But you come home and you see what's happening to Germany as the cost as well of the war, that maybe that's a thing that opens his eyes too, right?
I think summer of 43 is the moment where, it's one of those moments where things are beginning to turn. You can see 43 very much as a turning point in the war.
Well, Al has argued this very.
That's when they've lost.
Yeah, that's the moment when they've
43 is a year, isn't it?
If you're Napoleonic in the way you've you've had your Titanic battles that have cast the die, it's time to throw in the towel.
Yeah,
if you're viewing it in a 19th century prism.
I mean, that's I always make we're probably on the same page here, Al. But you make the comparison to the First World War. The point at which Germany sues for peace in the First World War. If you transfer that, the point where they realise they can no longer win. Yeah. Effectively, if you transfer that to World War II, it's the summer of 43.
Yeah, without a doubt. Yeah.
But they don't, right? And this is the whole thing. Hitler says there will never be another 1918 because he's going to bloody well fight on, and there's not going to be a betrayal on the home front and all of that. So they fight on for another 2 years.
So not only have you got this terrible wrong which is being committed in the East, you've also got a regime that is failing and a war that is catastrophic for the rest of Germany. So you've got two very good reasons for wanting the regime out. But there's these various attempts on Hitler's life. I mean, I mentioned the bottle of Cointreau. I can't remember if it was Cointreau or brandy or whatever it was. But I mean, it just doesn't go off, does it? I mean, it should have done, and that should have been the end of Hitler in 1943. When is that von Tresco taking the bottle on the on the Ju-52 or whatever it is.
Yeah, that's March 43. So it's the same time as Stauffenberg is in North Africa. And yeah, so Tresco.
But there are others, aren't there?
Yeah, exactly.
Other
And it's all
attempts.
Tresco. It's all Tresco at this point because he's in our Army Group Centre, and he's sort of collecting like-minded individuals. He's very good at that. He's very persuasive, very dynamic individual like Stauffenberg is. And he collects like-minded individuals. So as you can, for all the reasons that we've just described, there are, a few officers around the place that, you might sort of spot them raise an eyebrow when someone talks about the wonderful Führer, for example, and you'd get them alone and sort of have a quick chat with them and ascertain if they were safe to talk to or not. And he sort of collected people, and that's where he tries with this brandy bomb, this which is 2 British clam charges, which are used as sort of magnetic charges, supposed to be attached to railway lines to blow railway lines. So he had 2 of those, which had actually come from rounded up Abwehr, the Abwehr, which had been taken from SIS networks in Holland, which had been rounded up in 1940. So that's where the Abwehr comes back into play in this, because that's the network that they get the charges from. So he's got these 2 clam charges. They're about the size of a sort of hardback book, if you like. They're that sort of size and shape. And he sort of fashions this, puts 2 of them together, and dresses it up so it looks like a Cointreau bottle, a square bottle. I don't know quite in it. It doesn't sound to me much like a Cointreau bottle, but supposedly it did look like that. Which was then smuggled onto Hitler's plane. So Hitler came out to Smolensk, where he was based at the time, on a visit to Army Group Centre, and he smuggled it onto Hitler's plane on the way back, expecting it to sort of go off in midair. The next thing he hears, of course, is that Hitler's arrived, landed back at the Wolfschanze, at the Wolf's Lair, entirely safely. And the brandy bottle, in inverted commas, was then going to be delivered to, I think it was Colonel Stief or Colonel Brandt or someone else, whoever it was supposed to go to. And then he's got to send his adjutant to basically go and retrieve it before it gets unwrapped, and they realise that it's actually a bomb. So it's a wonderfully sort of cinematic moment.
Yeah.
But actually, those same charges then are used the following week. Hitler is visiting an exhibition of captured Soviet weaponry in the armory in Berlin. So that's for the German sort of Memorial Day, like Remembrance Day, effectively. Yeah. And he's been going to be shown around by this chap called Gersdorf, who's another one of Tresco's people that he's got on side. And Gersdorf that is willing to put these 2 clam charges into his tunic pockets and basically sort of follow Hitler around blow himself up. He was going to be, I think that would have been history's first suicide bomber had Gersdorf got away with it.
Wow.
But again, there's a lot of talk very often about Hitler and sort of a sixth sense for danger and so on. And maybe Gersdorf was sweating a bit too much. Yeah. A bit hard to tell, really. But Hitler was, very uninterested in everything that Gersdorf wanted to show him. He sort of rushes through the exhibition, goes out the back door, and Gersdorf is left there as a sort of ticking time bomb, and he has to take himself to the toilet and defuse himself.
Jesus Christ.
No euphemism intended.
Yeah.
So that was another failed plot, and then there was a couple more where there was another one, a chap called Axel von den Busche, who was going to do the same job as Gersdorf, and he was going to model a new winter uniform later in the year in 1943.
Made of dynamite.
and was going to blow himself up in Hitler's presence. And again, that was called off because the uniforms, the storage unit, wherever the uniforms were, was bombed by the British. There's some fabulous stories in all of this. But yeah, so Tresco tries with 4 sort of proxy attempts to blow Hitler up through 1943 and 44, and is unsuccessful at every turn. But I think, to give him his due, and I said the same thing about the Abwehr, but he's really crucial in laying the sort of psychological and moral groundwork for everything that follows. By the time that Stauffenberg does his thing in July 44, Tresco's kind of out of the loop. He's been moved on to a different army group, and he's been moved away from that network that he had created for himself. But he's really crucial in laying that sort of moral and spiritual groundwork.
Right. So Valkyrie. So Stauffenberg is transferred to the replacement army, which is the Ersatzarmee, which is if we had to find an equivalent, what, like a home guard, a TA, what is it?
Yeah, it's sort of so it is a home guard in that sense that it was it was established for two purposes. One was training of frontline units, so to oversee training of units that would go to the front. So new recruits and so on, they would go through that network. And then secondarily, it was kept on the home front to be held in reserve in the event of unrest. Now, if you bear in mind that Germany, of course, as we know, had literally millions of forced labourers of various stamps, whether it's Italians, French, Poles, Ukrainians, the list goes on, held in sort of different categories of camps. So the Italians initially were sort of, viewed as allies prior to 43, were kept in comparative, I wouldn't say luxury, but, in good conditions, whereas the Poles never were, the Ukrainians even worse. But there are literally millions of forced labourers across Germany. So, there's a potential risk there that if these guys get organised and get armed, then there could be trouble. So the replacement army was basically, part of its job was to provide homeland security, we could say.
And how big is it?
That's a very good question. One I don't really have an answer to be honest with you.
Because in the Nazi state, you have all these cogs, haven't they?
Yeah.
Because there's also the SS, there's also the Gestapo. There's, it's that usual thing where there's lots of competing factors.
I think they would have been units within every military district of Germany. There would have been units that represented the replacement army, because they're doing all of that. They're in a sense looking inwards rather than outwards, and responsible for training.
But the key thing is, though, this is a thing that army officers have got that isn't necessarily full of Nazis, right? So so that's why this becomes into the Valkyrie orbit, doesn't it? Into the plot. This is how it ends up part of it. They've got freedom of maneuver within it, right? The plotters.
To some extent, but I think we don't want to overestimate the extent to which there are people actively plotting at this point, because a lot of Valkyrie is predicated on those units involved acting in good faith, but not knowing what's going on.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So it's not as though they were all on side and they're all backing Stauffenberg and cheering that Hitler was dead, because that's absolutely not the case. So they have this plan called Valkyrie. The original Valkyrie plan is a contingency plan for dealing with domestic unrest, right?
Yeah.
And that's one that already pre-exists the plot and so on. And the plotters, and this is where Tresco still was in the loop. So Tresco and Stauffenberg at this point, they sort of, if you like, pervert Valkyrie to turn it into something slightly different, which is to turn it into a military coup, so that they can trigger those units to take control on the home front, to target those institutions, those buildings, and those individuals that they need to be neutralized. They can target all of those whilst taking power themselves in the event of an assassination.
And is that idea, that aspect of it, is that von Stauffenberg?
It's Stauffenberg and Tresco together, as I understand it. So they kind of come up with this idea that you can take this existing plan and sort of twist it for their own purposes.
Subvert it. But so what you now need is an assassin.
Exactly. So this is the problem that they faced, which was, bear in mind, of course, that these are fundamentally conservatives, right? They want to try and conserve something of Germany. So it's not enough just to kill Hitler at this point. If you just kill Hitler in 1943, 44, there'll be chaos. The fronts will collapse. The only winners in that scenario, they would have argued, would be the Soviets. The Soviets would sort of roll through and communize everything, and that's not what a German conservative military man wants. So, so you see, it's not enough just to kill Hitler. So you have to kill Hitler, and at the same time have a really thoroughgoing military coup to take power, from those elements of the SS and the regime. And then preserve fighting at the fronts, keep that going, so that the whole thing doesn't collapse.
So that's the big difference between previous plots, because the previous plots is just kill the Führer, don't worry about what follows. Now exactly. You've got to kind of get rid of him, replace him with something
something that can hold the line.
Well, is that because the flavour of the war has changed since 1941, where they're outraged by the genocide?
Yeah.
By 1944, you're losing, and the Soviets are rampant, and whatever's going to happen next on the Eastern Front, that is a really big part of what's motivating them. So they start with the moral end of it, and now they're ending up more expedient, perhaps, than moral.
Yes, but I suppose so. I mean, it is about trying to hold the line effectively, because if you just kill the leadership, then the state collapses, and the next moment the Red Army is in Berlin, and they don't want that.
Because in 1941, the emphasis is on destroying Bolshevism. Now you're being destroyed by Bolshevism.
Yes, exactly. So you're trying to hold that line. Yeah.
So Roger, in terms of planning, I mean, what's the time frame, and when are they aiming for, and what's their kind of moment where they can enact this?
So they've got this plan already set up by the autumn of 43. They've already got the plan ready, and they think, well, this could work, right? But again, as you said, you've got a plan for a coup, and you need an assassin. And at the time, they don't have an assassin. And Hitler is, by this stage of the war, pretty much a recluse. So where he used to kind of be seen in sort of pre-war, he'd be seen in public, essentially playing the role of a politician. So he'd be making public appearances, Bayreuth and places like that, the Olympics and so on. By the time of the war, especially later on in the war, he's hardly seen in public. And where he is, he's got really state-of-the-art security. He's got overlapping security units that with overlapping competencies, which is often not terribly efficient, but it seems to work. When you bear in mind that Churchill had, what was his name, Mr. Thompson was his bodyguard. Hitler had countless bodyguards, bodyguard units. The Leibstandarte of the SS was supposedly all a bodyguard unit, guarded all of his residences and HQs and so on. So he has bodyguards galore at this point. So it's a really, really very well functioning security system, and he practically doesn't get out. He doesn't get seen in public. So you need someone on the inside. So that's what they lack. They don't have an assassin. And a few people are sounded out. The most famous one was a chap called Colonel Stieff, who was initially willing to go along with it, and then was, the description of Stieff was that he was jittery as a racehorse. They described him, and he said, "No, I can't do it. So he sort of backed out of being the assassin. And the stroke of fortune that they have, which is only a couple of weeks before Stauffenberg's actual attempt on Hitler's life, is that Stauffenberg is promoted to the staff as I think he's the adjutant of General Fromm, who's the head of the replacement army, and in that capacity, he's required to report to Hitler. So suddenly, you've got from one day to the next, you've got access. So then you've got Stauffenberg, who is not only to a large extent, having supplanted Tresckow as the sort of moral and dynamic force of the resistance, because Tresckow was kind of out of the loop. He's now got to play assassin as well, so he's got to be in two places at once, and that's a sort of fundamental failing of the plot. So from I think it was mid-June, he's basically got that position where he's got to go and report to Hitler. So it's kind of game on.
Gosh. So on the 11th of July, there's an aborted attempt at the Berghof. I mean, this is the thing, is it all speeds up.
So this is with von Stauffenberg?
Yes. Yeah, so he had those two clam charges. He had them in his briefcase.
Wow.
He doesn't, and he's not able to pull it off.
At the time, that first attempt, they wanted to, basically get rid of as many of the senior members of the regime as possible.
And there's just not enough there.
And there weren't enough there.
But also,
so he pulls the plug on it.
But von Stauffenberg questions whether they should continue after D-Day, doesn't he, and Bagration?
Well, I mean, he does. He says, is it worth it? Effectively, is it worth it? And this is where actually Tresckow and that question of moral force comes in, because Tresckow says absolutely. He said, he says it doesn't matter if we succeed or not. He said the point is that we're showing. The phrase is that we're showing there was a different Germany. So this is where it comes back. This is that argument you say about expediency, Al. Yeah, there is a degree of expediency, but they're also trying to do something because it's right.
Yeah.
So we shouldn't lose sight of that.
Yeah, I know. Of course, their options are running out, and time's running out. So there's that attempt. Then the 15th, there's another aborted attempt at the Wolfschanze.
Yeah, Hitler leaves the room. So it's
incredible.
Yeah. So I mean, it's interesting with Stauffenberg because he says he basically says at that point, I'm not backing out again. Because the line he used at the time was, this is a road you go down only once. So obviously he was feeling the nerves, as it were. He was also, I think, jittery as a racehorse at this point.
Yeah, well, I can only imagine. I mean, you've and of course, I mean, the risk is you're killed too, isn't it? After all. So he gets to come the 20th of July. That's the next meeting. Yeah. And Stauffenberg is required to present to Hitler. So, I mean, he has to be there. So, I mean, there's some complete plausible deniability in that, isn't there? Is that if Hitler's summoned to you,
so that fits perfectly.
It's nothing phony about the meeting. And so 8:00 on the 20th July, he flies to the Wolfschanze with his adjutant, Werner von Haeften. And is von Haeften in on it too?
Yes, von Haeften's in on it, absolutely.
Right. Yeah. 11:30, they meet with Keitel.
Yeah,
12
again scheduled meeting.
I'm feeling tense just going through this. I mean,
yeah.
And there's a thought that maybe they're going to get Mussolini too, isn't there?
Mussolini was visiting Wolfschanze that day.
2 for the price of 1.
Yeah, yeah. I mean that would have kind of blown out the plausible deniability that you mentioned, because the whole thing was designed to hit Hitler in the planning meeting in the planning conference.
So, but the meeting's brought forward because of the Mussolini visit. So Stauffenberg's meeting with the Führer is brought forward at 12:25. He's asked to change his shirt.
Yeah,
because he's hot and sweaty.
Because he's hot and sweaty.
It was a hot day. It was a hot day.
I sympathise with him. I get that.
But this is his ulterior motive, of course. He's wanting to go and fuse his bomb. So he's got to go and do that. He's given space to do that with von Haeften. Changes his shirt, of course. Has the 2 clam charges. He fuses one of them.
Why only one?
Well, this is a mistake. And I think this is testament to the nervous state that he must have been in. The record says that he was, and I think again this ties in with what I was saying earlier about him teaching himself to write again and so on. He wanted to be, he had von Haeften there, who was in on it and was his adjutant. Von Haeften, who had both functioning hands, wasn't maimed, could quite easily have fused the time pencil, which you have to do with a pair of pliers. You have to sort of crush the time pencil, and it releases this. I think it's copper chloride or something, which eats through the lead and makes the thing work. So it's going to work in about 10 minutes. It's because it's a chemical reaction. Heat will speed it up. So it's a bit of a movable feast as to how long the fuse works for. But it's got to be enacted or made to work with a pair of pliers. And Stauffenberg absolutely wanted to be the man that did that. He wanted to do it himself. Yes.
He wants ownership. Moral ownership of the moment. Yeah.
In spite of the fact he's only got 2 fingers and a thumb, which can't have been great. So he's kind of struggling with that. I think this is trying to explain why he forgets to put the second charge in. The second charge would have exploded. Via a sympathetic explosion anyway. All he needed to do was put it in his bag, but he didn't. So anyway, he's got one of these clam charges fused now. It's going to go off in about 10 minutes.
So the result of that is there's not enough charge.
Yes, effectively.
There is not. Yes, there's not going to be. Hasn't happened yet, Jim.
No. There's not. I wasn't saying, but there isn't enough charge to do what they're planning to do.
It's half the bomb it should have been. It's half the bomb.
It's half the bomb it should have been.
Yeah.
I mean, for those people who like longue durée history and the idea that everything is fated, we couldn't be more contingent here on how a man feels, what he's capable of, and how personality plays directly into the fate of continents, of nations, of millions.
Oh my goodness me! It should have been so different.
Yeah, that we're right in the contingency of what people are like here, rather than the tectonic plates of history.
Human frailty, human error,
human nature. So he returns to the briefing room.
Yes.
And does anyone smell a rat?
No, they don't actually. There's a wonderful quote from Walter Warlimont, who is one of Hitler's general staff. I'm sure you know, he wrote a very good memoir. Warlimont actually, described Stauffenberg coming into the room. So he's got this eye patch, and he's got one arm, his hand missing on one arm, and he describes him as the sort of classic image of the warrior through history. As he comes into the room, obviously not realizing that he was about to blow up Commander-in-Chief. So he comes in. He's already sort of made preparations. He said that because of his injuries, his hearing was bad. So he wanted to be located close to Hitler. So good little tactical move there. There's 24 people in the room around a large oak table, and the table itself has sort of solid, if you like, slab legs on either end, if that makes sense. So rather than sort of single legs, but sort of slab legs, I suppose that's how I describe them to myself. But all in solid oak. So he's allocated a place close to Hitler. The conference is already going on. So I think it was Adolf Heusinger speaking, is one of the other generals present. And bear in mind, these conferences usually went on for a couple of hours, and people came and went. It wasn't unusual for people to come in and leave and go and take phone calls or whatever. So Stauffenberg comes in, sort of excuses himself. He's shown to his position close to Hitler, puts the bag down underneath the table, and he puts it down on the inside of that slab leg, crucially.
Oh, and that's a mistake, is it?
No, that's not the mistake. The mistake is that subsequently it gets moved. But he puts it on the inside of the slab leg. He then mutters something about making a phone call and shuffles out the room again. Nobody would have batted an eyelid to any of this. The presentation carries on. Heusinger's speaking. Hitler's sort of consulting maps, leaning over the heavy oak table, consulting maps and so on.
The way he loved to. He loved a map.
The way he loved that. He loved to have
formations around on maps,
his fingers in the military pie, as it were.
Yeah.
So Stauffenberg leaves the room, and at 12:42 precisely, the bomb explodes.
We will see you in our next episode to talk about the plot to kill Hitler. Thanks for listening. You've been listening to me, Al Murray, James Holland of Roger Moorhouse. And of course, if you want to know what happened next, subscribe to our Apple channel, subscription channel, or our Patreon. Bye.
Auf Wiedersehen.
Goodbye. See you soon.